morning, professor, classmates. My name is Ana Sofia Rivera, and today I'm gonna share with you the topic 6.1, European Union from our contemporary international politics course. I want to start my presentation with a quote from Moreno that says, European construction as a whole historical process has gone through different stages of interaction between others of global and regional nature that together have helped define its own advances and mishaps, possibly more linear from an economic standpoint, but at the same time inconsistent and insecure from a political standpoint. So we need to understand this process as a combination of different situations that have evolved through the years. Some historical developments before starting to describe the process is, first of all, the Second World War. We need to remember that after the Second World War, Europe was devastated in a material, but also in an economic, political, and social way. So in order to aid its biggest ally, the US set into motion the Marshall Plan, that it was an economic aid principally made of donations in order to help reignite economic influx in the European Union. However, we should also bear in mind that this aid provided by the US wasn't equal amongst all the European countries. There was also a sense of cooperation as the main goal for Europe amongst different political actors. And a third important thing to mention is that in 1950, the Schuman Plan or the Schuman Discourse was set. Schuman was the Prime Minister of France that stated that Europe needed coal and steel organization to help manage its principal or primary economic source. So we start with the beginning from 1944 to 1960. And even though we already said 1950, we're gonna go a little bit back in time to 1944, where the Benelux was created. The Benelux is the combination of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It was a treaty, a pact, and an alliance between these countries. First of all, to protect themselves among the different powers in Europe, we need to remember that these three countries were originally neutral during the Second World War, but as the war progressed, they were invaded and deprived of their neutrality. Therefore, their societies were abused. So they created this alliance to protect themselves as a security blanket, let's say it that way. But not just that. Also, the purpose of the Benelux was cooperation, and yes, the majorly economical cooperation, but also social and legal cooperation. Between them, between these three countries, there was no customs barriers to ensure free movement of people, goods, and services. And the next important thing is the European Coal and Steel Community that was established by the Treaty of Paris in 1951, was signed, 1952 was set into motion. This community aimed to contribute through the common market for coal and steel to economic expansion, employment, and better living standards. We remember from the previous slide the Schuman Plan. The Prime Minister said this idea and was set into motion. But which countries were part of the ECSC? Where, well, in a surprising move, France and Germany allied themselves, and Italy was included in the mix. And these three countries paired with Benelux in order to create this community. So the 6 original countries of the ancients from the ancient part of the timeline where Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Germany, and Italy. A little bit later in 1957, setting the motion in 1958, established by the Rome treaties. It's actually one treaty, but at the same two, because both were signed in Rome, but for different institutions. The European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community were born. The first one aimed to, by creating a common market, transform the conditions of trade and production and serve as a step towards the closer political unification of Europe. As a curious fact, the EEC was still actively doing until the Lisbon Treaty. That's when the EEC was shut down from its operations. And well, the second one, that it's commonly known as Eurotam, aimed to create a specialized market on nuclear power, because we need to remember that one of the major economic capacities of the continent was the usage of nuclear power for industry and different types of industry, but from all manufacturing, etc., etc., etc. During this time, during 1944 and 1960, we have 2 points to make clear. First of all, during this period of time, the idea wasn't exactly to find growth within Europe, but to reconstruct it and ignite its economy and to help survive its population. So this period of time, it's solely based on that. And also, two institutions were also born during this time that weren't mentioned in the previous slide. This is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, commonly known as GATT, in 1947, that created the guidelines for the different communities previously mentioned and the ones who were further created. And also the European Free Trade Association, commonly known as EFTA, in 1960. But we need to point that this association was UK's whim. UK was not invited into the party of the ECSC, and in order to, or the EEC, so in order to contrast the power of these major political association, they created their own one, but it wasn't as powerful and it wasn't as important as the EEC or the ECSC. Then we go to the second stage of my presentation, that is the European growth from 1961 to 1986. And this section, it starts with the merger treaty, also known as the Brussels Treaty, that was signed in 1965, but was set into motion in 1967. And the main purpose of this treaty was the unification of executive bodies across the various economic organizations of Europe. This meant that the unification of the different executive bodies, of the Eurotam from the EEC that had their own jurisdiction, but during this treaty, they say, okay, we're gonna combine our forces and create just different institutions for different areas, but just for us, not one for each one, but one for everyone. So during this treaty, two organizations were born, and another three were brought back of their and their importance was made clear once again. From a political perspective, this time was also important since it marked the end of dictatorships in Europe, in the Western world. By 1975, the last far-right dictatorships in Europe that were Portugal in 1974 and Spain in 1975 had finally come to an end, marking a new stage in political relations inside the continent. Also, the CEE gained its first enlargement in 1972 and 1973, when Britain, the UK, Denmark, and Ireland became part of the community, followed by Greece in 1981, and then by Spain and Portugal in 1986. We can see here another map of how it marked a bigger stage, a bigger part. And the last important bit of this area is a single European Act that was signed in 1986. This is a treaty which provides the basis of a vast 6-year program aimed at sorting out the problems with the free flow of trade across the EU borders, and thus creates the single market. This is also an important part in the jurisdiction of the legal framework in the EU. Executive bodies of the community after the merger treaty, we have 5. 2 formed by the treaty, that it's the Council of the European Communities and the Commission of the European Communities, that even though they have changed their name, still remain as part of the institutional bodies of the European Union. And we also have another 3 executive bodies, the Parliamentary Assembly and the EESC, that it stands for European Economic and Social Community, both formed in 1957, and the Court of Justice that was founded in 1952. During this time of growth of Europe, it was a little bit of a mix between a lot of things. Yes, indeed, there was a lot of economic growth, but also cooperation proliferated. The different European countries agreed to join control over food production so that everybody now had enough to eat, because we need to remember that starvation was really common during the post-Second World War period. So hunger was a really important topic in the table. There was also, a short yet brutal Arab-Israeli war in October in 1973 that created a crisis from an economic and political perspective inside Europe. Also, we need to remember in 1968, there was a huge wave of student rallies, and that affected different parts of the world, not just the continent. Also, help was started to get noticed. So the EU regional policy starts to transfer huge sums of money to create jobs and infrastructure in poor areas. And also the European Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly, start to increase its influence in the UE affairs. And by 1979, the citizens of the member states of the CEE can now elect the members directly. And now we go to the last part of the consolidation, the final stages to consolidation, that it's the 6-year period from 1987 to 1993. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred, and in 1991, the USSR disintegrated, which marked a new period in international relations. Now there was more place to expand, more places to achieve the different goals set by the EEC. And of course, the cherry on top, the treaty that changed everything, was the Treaty of the European Union, signed in 1992, set into motion in 1993, also known as the Maastricht Treaty. It dictated the transition to the European Community from the European Economic Community. This agreement gave the EC broader authority on a wide array of topics, for example, the community policies on development, education, public health, consumer protection, and and environmental protection. That, as a fun fact, the EU is one of the pioneers on environmental law and environmental protection because of climate change. Also, to these institution, the task of creating social and economic cohesion was placed upon them, and also the need to create technological research. This treaty also established EU citizenship, so now you didn't just have your national citizenship, but also a EU citizenship. Sorry. And in this treaty, there was also an important part, but I'm not gonna dive into it since it's the next topic, but it also incorporated monetary policy, where a single currency was brought to the conversation, was brought to the table, and that meant the euro. Inside the Treaty of the European Union, there were also marked 3 funding pillars of this institution, of this regional community. The 3 pillars were the European communities, all the executive institutions that we have mentioned earlier, and some that were transformed, a common foreign and security policy, and an enhanced cooperation in domestic and foreign affairs in a wide array of topics that relate to every aspect of the political sphere. For the next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 other important considerations. First, the creation of an European identity, but this I'm only going to talk like really briefly, since I'm gonna add to the link to my presentation a link of a video that I believe it's really illustrative and really important to watch on regards of the creating the identity of what it means to be European, and how it has evolved, and how it shapes the society of people that lived within the European Union borders. But originally, the foundation or the pillars of the European identity revolved around democracy, liberalism, and Christianity. So these are like the principal pillars of the European identity. But we know that not everything is perfect in this world. So there have been also a lot of struggles during its institution. And I'm gonna mark principally 2, 3. The first one is the UK's case, Brexit. A brief story on what happens here. When the UK was a member, started to be a member of the CEE in 1973, it had passed nearly 10 years from its first attempt to be part of it. The third time's the charm, and after the third try, the UK was finally accepted into the EEC. So first, we have to bear in mind this tension between the UK and the already powers of the EEC. And once the UK was inside of the EEC, realized that it wasn't as good as they thought. They realized that they didn't have a strong power, at least not in that moment, amongst the institutions of the European Union. And just 2 years after its addition to the EEC, they created a referendum in their society if they wanted to leave the UK. The first Brexit was done, well, the first Brexit referendum was done in 1975. The referendum came, the polls came as, no, we don't want to leave the European Union. Well, in that case, the CEE, the EEC, sorry, the European Economic Community. But as time passed by, not all the society was completely pleased with the idea of UK being part of the supranational institution that rule across Europe. We need to remember that the UK had an imperialist state of mind, where everything was at their reach. We also need to remember, we need to point out there was a high rate of British populism, and the role of nationalism, the so-called Englishness, also played an important part of the decision that later the UK would leave the EU. And also this part, it has a lot to do with the second struggle that I point out from the EU. So by 2016, there was a second Brexit referendum, and the polls went out, and between 59.1% wanting to leave and 48.1% wanting to stay, the decision to leave the EU was officially made, and by 2020, the UK is no longer part of the EU, and it becomes the first member state to resign to its position and leave the European Union. Right now, there is also speculation of a possible Polexit, but that's another topic, far more complicated. And well, regarding this part of the British populism and the role of nationalism, we also need to mention the enormous wave of Euroscepticism and the right and far-right governments and movement proliferations in Europe. I want to quote Rodriguez and Lopez here on a really important part of the importance of the ideology and the presence of certain radical groups among society in order to push certain policies. It says, political agrupations that are officially institutionalized and characterized by spreading and defending conservative, ultranationalist, and sometimes monarchical ideologies, which do not accept equality among citizens, and from the perspective of some specialists are extremely elitist and excluding. Their ideology is excluding in social terms, which materializes vis-a-vis on migrants who arrive from the non-Western world and whose skin color is not white. Euroscepticism and the rise of the right and far-right governments as movement, it's also an immediate response on the migration crisis that has happened for this century, during this century in Europe. People are seeing that this beautiful place that the EU said that everything will be better and everything will be improved is not happening at the speed rate they wanted it to happen. So it's creating a lot of conflict. And in order to calm these agrupations that see migrants as a threat to their well-being, to their life, to their jobs, to their economic growth, it's really, really important that to realize that. And also another thing that has Euroscepticism growing day by day during our times is the COVID pandemic. We need to remember that the European Union has not been the best example at managing the pandemic for a long time. The European Union was the center stage of the pandemic. To this day, they haven't managed it correctly. They have been on several lockdowns and had different waves. So the global and the European, the global and regional panoramic do not help to show that the European Union is a solution to the different and the various problems that attack our society nowadays. And this has led the small gap that was before grow and grow wider and wider for all these conservative ideologies to proliferate and try to change the narrative and explain that supranationalism, it's not working. We need to change and go back to our ways. So this is a really concerning moment that's happening in the EU. And this conversation brings to my conclusion, my last part of the presentation. Where does Europe's future lie? It's really complicated. Before the COVID pandemic, I believe that specialists and people, academics, people who know about the subject would give a bigger life expectancy to Europe, to the European Union. However, with the migration crisis growing exponentially and with the COVID pandemic still haunting us, I do believe that Europe's future it's unstable, and unfortunately or fortunately, depending who you ask, the European Union will cease to exist in the future years. We've seen an alarming increase of far-right movements and far-right governments, not just in Europe, but globally, that are tired of this liberalist world and are planning to return to their closed ideas, to their closed views, and this is my land, this is my territory, and I don't trust supranational entities anymore, and I don't believe cooperation is the best way to do. So from my perspective, but I keep the question open for any dialogue or any discussion, debate that anyone wants to bring. I do believe that Europe's future is not a really bright one. Thank you. I hope you found this presentation enlightening. And as I said, I will be adding the link for the explanation of the construction of the European identity to the classroom board, as well as this presentation and the link of the YouTube presentation that you are viewing right now. Hope you have a wonderful day, and any question that may arise while watching this presentation, I'll be glad to answer it. Have a nice day.